In the quiet blue-gray hours before sunrise on a Sunday morning, the people of Benin had no idea that their country was about to be thrown into a storm. Most families were still asleep, church bells had not yet begun to ring, and the streets of Cotonou were calm. Yet inside the National Television building, boots slammed against the floor, rifles were raised, and a group of soldiers seized the state broadcaster. Within minutes, a tired nation woke up to a chilling announcement: the president had been removed, the constitution suspended, the borders sealed. And for a moment, a very real moment, it looked like West Africa was witnessing yet another successful military takeover. But then just hours later, everything flipped. What began as a confident coup collapsed before midday. The government reappeared, the coup plotters fled, and the entire country was left stunned by the speed of the reversal. How does a mutiny that begins with such precision fall apart so quickly? Who intervened? Who benefited? And perhaps most importantly, who is really holding the controls in West Africa today? Because behind the scenes, far away from the cameras, something else happened. Something that changed the direction of the crisis. A phone call from Paris, fighter jets scrambling from Nigeria, a president disappearing only to reappear inside the French embassy. These are not details you can ignore. These are clues. So tonight we are going to walk through this story carefully, step by step, to understand what really happened in Benin and what it reveals about the future of an entire region. As you watch, I invite you to ask yourself, is this truly democracy at work? Or are we witnessing a quiet battle between old powers and new forces rising across Africa? If you believe the truth matters, if you want to follow stories that the headlines often hide, please subscribe and stay with us until the end. The answers here may surprise you. By the time the sun finally rose over Cotonou, the drama had already been underway for hours. What happened in Benin on December 7th wasn't simply a coup attempt, it was a race against time. A contest between a handful of determined mutineers and an entire state apparatus that was caught off guard, yet somehow managed to recover before noon. It began in the stillness before dawn. Lieutenant Colonel Pascal Tigre, a mid-ranking officer with growing frustrations and bold ambitions, led a team of armed soldiers into the national broadcaster. The operation was swift and deliberate. They were not rookies. They moved with the kind of confidence that suggested long nights of planning. As ordinary citizens slept, Tigre's men positioned themselves around cameras and studio lights, their helmets shining under the harsh glow of the set. And then Benin woke up to the announcement that everything it knew had come undone. On live television, Tigre declared that President Patrice Talon had been removed from office. The constitution was suspended, state institutions dissolved, borders closed, airspace shut down. It was a textbook blueprint, a coup straight out of the region's playbook. In Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and even Guinea-Bissau, similar declarations had marked the beginning of successful takeovers. For a few intense moments, it seemed that Benin was destined to become the next domino. But the mutineers had a fatal flaw: they controlled only the story, not the state. While Tigre proclaimed a new era of fraternity, justice, and work, loyalist forces were already mobilizing. Unlike other nations where coups stretched across days, Benin's security structure did not fracture. Commanders stayed loyal. Units refused to defect, and critically, the mutineers never reached the two locations they needed most: the presidential residence and the military command headquarters. Without those, the announcement on television was theater, not power. By mid-morning, confusion began to spread. Citizens weren't seeing soldiers on the streets. Government offices were not occupied. And the country's senior officials, though silent at first, had not been detained. Still, one question created a thick cloud of uncertainty over Cotonou. Where was President Patrice Talon? The silence was suffocating. In coup situations, when a leader disappears, the worst is assumed. Across the capital, phones buzzed as embassies issued warnings. The French embassy reported gunfire near the presidential residence and urged its citizens to shelter in place. The U.S. embassy advised Americans to avoid the area entirely. Russia's mission told its citizens to remain home. The streets emptied as military convoys patrolled in tight formation. For several hours, Benin balanced on a knife's edge. And then, just as abruptly as the coup began, the narrative shifted. Interior Minister Alassane Seydu appeared ironically on the same television channel the mutineers had seized, declaring that the coup had been crushed. Loyalist forces, he said, had regained control. The plotters were fleeing. Order was being restored. His tone was calm, confident, almost surgical, as if to assure viewers that the crisis never truly slipped from the government's hands. But one detail stood out above all: President Talon was alive and safe inside the French embassy. This revelation reshaped the entire crisis. It explained the silence. It raised new questions about who was protecting him, and it suggested that foreign actors were already involved long before the fighting stopped. As for Tigray, the man who just hours earlier stood on national television declaring himself the new authority of the Republic, he was now a fugitive. Reports indicated that about a dozen soldiers had been arrested, with security forces combing through the city to capture the rest. What cannot be overlooked is this: the coup didn't fail because it was small. It failed because it never penetrated the core of state power. And in a region where 9 coups have succeeded since 2020, this one stood out not for its boldness, but for its speed of collapse. The turning point of the entire crisis did not happen on the ground in Cotonou. It happened in the silence between 2 presidents, one in Paris, one in Abuja, and it happened at a speed that startled even seasoned observers of West African politics. As loyalist forces tightened their grip and coup plotters scattered, a different battle was unfolding behind closed doors. It began with a message posted by French President Emmanuel Macron. The statement seemed simple. At first, he had spoken with Nigerian President Bola Tinubu about the situation in Benin, but the phrasing was strange, almost too deliberate. Macron wrote that, at his request, we will strengthen our partnership. Those 5 words would reshape the narrative, because just minutes after Macron's message went live, Nigerian fighter jets were already in the skies above Cotonou. For many West Africans, and certainly for those who study regional geopolitics, this was the true moment of escalation. The mutiny at the television station might have been dramatic, but the sudden appearance of Nigerian warplanes signaled something far more consequential: a foreign military posture inside the airspace of a sovereign state. Nigeria's official explanation was measured and diplomatic. The jets, they said, were conducting surveillance to ensure that instability would not spill across the border into Nigeria's southwest, a region deeply intertwined with Benin through trade migration and security cooperation. Officials warned of potential refugee flows, terrorist infiltration, and economic disruption. They framed the mission as both humanitarian concern and preventive action. But the timing told another story. Fighter jets do not scramble by accident. They do not appear over a neighboring capital without coordination, and more importantly, without political approval. And when the approval appears to follow a phone call from France, the symbolism becomes impossible to ignore. For generations, France has maintained deep political, economic, and military influence across its former colonies. Yet, in recent years, that influence has been eroded, sometimes violently. Mali expelled French troops. Burkina Faso expelled French troops. Niger expelled French troops. France was losing ground across the Sahel. Benin, however, remained one of its few remaining footholds. So, when President Patrice Talon was confirmed to be hiding inside the French embassy during the mutiny, many saw it as more than a safety measure. It was a sign of where real protection and perhaps real authority flowed from. Meanwhile, regional institutions responded with unusual speed. ECOWAS issued a stern condemnation within hours, threatening consequences for anyone attempting to overturn constitutional order. The African Union followed with a similar message. The reactions were almost synchronized, as if pre-scripted for a moment that everyone anticipated but no one wanted to admit had been coming. Yet the silence on an equally important issue did not go unnoticed. Neither ECOWAS nor the African Union had spoken out days earlier, when Benin's parliament extended the presidential term from 5 to 7 years and excluded the opposition from the upcoming election. That selective concern raised uncomfortable questions. Were these institutions defending democracy or defending incumbents? Were they guardians of constitutional order or instruments of geopolitical influence? As these debates unfolded, the fate of the mutineers became increasingly clear. Lieutenant Tigray, once the confident face of the takeover, was now on the run. A dozen soldiers had been arrested. Security forces continued to hunt for the remaining fugitives. The picture that emerged was not of a powerful uprising, but of a desperate and poorly connected group whose grievances, while real, failed to translate into meaningful support within the armed forces. Still, the most dramatic part of the crisis was not its beginning or even its end. It was the realization that the decisive moment had come from outside the country's borders. The jets above Cotonou, the French embassy sheltering a president, the international statements that arrived faster than domestic confirmations, all of this pointed to a deeper reality. West Africa's political struggles are no longer confined to West Africa. They are influenced, shaped, and sometimes controlled by the invisible hands of global actors who still see the region not as sovereign nations but as strategic assets. When the dust finally settled and calm returned to Cotonou's streets, many outside observers assumed the crisis had passed. But inside Benin, the atmosphere told a different story, one of relief, yes, but also of deep and lingering unease. A failed coup does not erase the conditions that created it, it exposes them. For ordinary citizens, the hours of uncertainty were frightening and disorienting. Families who had lived through the stability of Benin's earlier decades suddenly heard warnings to stay inside. Parents whispered to their children to keep away from windows, shops closed their doors, taxi drivers abandoned their routes. In a matter of minutes, a peaceful coastal capital was transformed into a ghost city, not by open fighting, but by fear of what might come next, fear of what was happening behind the walls of government buildings. Even after the mutiny collapsed, that fear did not vanish. People began asking the questions that matter most in any democracy. How did we get here? How close did we come to losing everything? Is the government listening to us or only to itself? Because the truth, as many Beninese citizens already knew, is that this coup attempt didn't emerge from thin air. It grew from months of political tension, mistrust, and decisions that appeared to undermine the country's democratic foundations. Just weeks before the mutiny, Benin's parliament extended presidential terms from 5 to 7 years, a controversial move passed with speed and little transparency. Opposition parties cried foul. Civil society groups warned of democratic backsliding. Yet the amendment went forward. More troubling still, the main opposition candidate was barred from participating in the upcoming 2026 election due to a restrictive sponsorship requirement, effectively ensuring that President Talon's preferred successor would face little competition. For a country once celebrated as one of West Africa's strongest democracies, these developments felt like a painful step backward. These political tensions intensified within the military as well. Many soldiers, especially those stationed in the north where jihadist violence has been rising, felt neglected and under-resourced. Some complained of fallen comrades being forgotten, while others spoke quietly of promotions going to the politically connected rather than the most deserving. It was this atmosphere of resentment that Lieutenant Tigre tapped into, though his attempt was ultimately misguided and unsupported. The failed coup also had a chilling effect on civic life. Activists who had been warning about creeping authoritarianism felt vindicated but also exposed. They feared that the government, emboldened by its victory, might use the mutiny as justification to tighten control, silence critics, and impose new security measures in the name of stability. Meanwhile, the revelation that President Talon had sought refuge in the French embassy stirred strong emotions among citizens. Some felt betrayed, questioning whether their leader trusted his own nation's institutions or whether foreign influence played a larger role than anyone had admitted. Others felt embarrassed that a national crisis had even briefly placed Benin's sovereignty under the shadow of its former colonial ruler. All of these reactions point to a deeper truth. Although the coup failed, Benin is not out of danger. The underlying political fractures remain. The social trust that once formed the bedrock of the country's stability has been shaken. And unless meaningful reforms address the sources of unrest, constitutional manipulation, military grievances, and exclusion of the opposition, the nation may find itself facing new storms in the future. The coup did not break Benin, but it did reveal how fragile things have become. From Washington to Paris, from Abuja to Moscow, the failed coup in Benin was not viewed as an isolated domestic disturbance. It was seen as part of a broader geopolitical struggle unfolding across West Africa, a region where alliances are shifting, old powers are being challenged, and new models of governance are emerging. To understand why the world reacted so quickly and so sharply, one must look beyond Benin's borders and examine the deeper contest taking place on the African continent. For the United States, the episode was a reminder of how fragile West Africa has become. The U.S. response was cautious, but unmistakably alert. The American embassy advised citizens to avoid key areas of Cotonou and stay indoors until clarity returned. While Washington did not intervene directly and had no intention of doing so, it watched the events closely because West Africa is increasingly a battleground for influence between global powers. The U.S. has seen Russia expand through military partnerships, China deepen its economic footprint, and France fight desperately to retain what remains of its historical leverage. From the perspective of American policymakers, the stability of states like Benin is not merely a humanitarian concern, it is a matter of strategic importance. The Gulf of Guinea is a critical maritime corridor. The region is rich in minerals, energy potential, and fast-growing markets. Instability opens the door to extremist groups, uncontrolled migration flows, and the erosion of democratic institutions. The failed mutiny demonstrated how suddenly a politically fragile environment can shift and why intelligence services across the Atlantic are keeping a close eye on regional dynamics. But no outside actor was as visibly shaken or as quick to move as France. Paris understood the symbolism of this crisis. After being expelled from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, France has found itself losing influence across the Sahel with astonishing speed. Benin remains one of the few coastal states still aligned with French interests. That is why President Patrice Talon's decision to seek refuge inside the French embassy was so politically explosive. It was more than a plea for safety, it was a statement about where real protection and perhaps real loyalty still lies. The immediate phone call from President Macron to President Tinubu only intensified suspicion. Nigeria's rapid deployment of fighter jets into Benin's airspace seemed to support the theory that France still holds the ability to mobilize regional allies when its strategic interests are threatened. For critics of French policy in Africa, the episode felt like a familiar story, Paris pulling strings behind the scenes while African institutions publicly claimed to defend democracy. Outside the West, other global powers observed carefully. Russia, now a growing security partner for several Sahel nations, limited its response to embassy warnings, but undoubtedly took note of France's assertiveness. China, focused on long-term economic investment, remained silent but attentive. In both capitals, analysts will view Benin as another indicator of whether France's regional influence is collapsing or recalibrating. What the world learned from this crisis is that West Africa is entering a new era, where every political shock reverberates internationally. A failed coup is not just a domestic incident, it is a signal, a reminder that global powers still see the region as strategic, contested, and full of opportunities and vulnerabilities. For the United States, for Europe, for rising powers in the East, and for African nations seeking sovereignty, Benin has become another chapter in a much larger story who will shape the future of the continent and on whose terms. When Benin finally emerged from the shadows of those tense hours, many celebrated the collapse of the coup as a victory for constitutional order. But victories like this one are never as simple as they appear. A failed mutiny may restore a government, but it rarely restores trust. And trust, once shaken, becomes the most fragile currency a nation can possess. Because what unfolded in Benin was not merely the story of soldiers storming a television station, it was a window into a deeper crisis, one born from constitutional manipulation, political exclusion, and a growing belief that ordinary citizens are losing their voice in the direction of their own country. The soldiers who mutinied were wrong in their method, but the grievances they pointed to were not imagined. They came from a society feeling squeezed between fear of instability and the frustration of a democracy that no longer feels responsive. Even more unsettling was the unmistakable involvement of foreign actors. The president sheltering in the French embassy. A phone call from Paris immediately followed by fighter jets from Nigeria. International statements arriving faster than updates from Benin's own government. For many Beninese and for millions across West Africa, these events reopened an old wound, the fear that their nations are still treated as strategic assets rather than sovereign countries. And now the most important question is the one that lingers long after the coup plotters have been arrested. What happens next? Will Benin confront the political tensions that made this coup possible? Will its leaders reverse the constitutional changes that pushed the country toward crisis? Will opposition voices be allowed to participate freely in the 2026 election? Or will this moment simply be remembered as a temporary disruption ignored until the next storm arrives? For Americans watching from afar, especially those who have seen decades of shifting alliances and global power struggles, Benin offers a familiar lesson: stability built on silence does not last. Real security comes from legitimacy, from fairness, from people believing their institutions serve them, not foreign interests, not entrenched elites. And this leads us to a broader truth about Africa today. Across the continent, leaders like Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso are challenging old patterns of external control and calling for a new model of sovereignty, one where African nations speak for themselves and decide their own future. Whether one agrees with his methods or not, the movement he represents speaks to a hunger for dignity and independence that cannot be ignored. So tonight I leave you with this question. Do you believe West Africa is truly stepping into a new era of self-determination, or are we watching old powers tighten their grip through new methods? If you found value in this conversation, if you believe the truth deserves to be heard without filters, please share this video. And if you want to stay ahead of the headlines, especially when it comes to Africa's rising sovereignty movement, subscribe and turn on notifications. Your engagement helps shine light where it matters most.